This is International Master Eric Kislik, and today we're going to look at one of the nicest tactics I've ever seen before. In one of my previous videos about one of the hardest moves you'll ever see, I'd actually tested the position even on players as high up as Caruana. Fortunately, he was able to give me some feedback. Also sent it to Geary. And for this position here, not this position now, but the position we're going to look at later on, I tested it with 5 Grandmasters, and it's always interesting to see the kind of feedback, just for me to get some kind of intuition on whether or not this is something that is possible to find or realistic or just too deep. And my impression on this one is that it was just too deep. There were young Grandmasters rated 2550 who had basically no chance. So I think I'm being very fair in calling the combination we're going to see much later on in this game the best interference tactic ever played. So this is from the game Komodo Stockfish, played in TCEC Season 15, Division P, going on now. This was from Game 15. I'm going to try to skip over the opening phase relatively quickly because it's not important to the actual interference tactic. So just kind of a normal Italian game start to the game. B4, bishop b6, a4, a6, knight bd2, castle, h3. All pretty natural play here. For the most part, a lot of the time what happens here is black plays d5 at some point or plays bishop e6 at some point. The play kind of fizzles out in the center, and a lot of the time in Grandmaster play, these lines are very drawish. But the play became very interesting. Stockfish played knight h5. And now Komodo castled. I think knight f1 is a good alternative here, just going knight f1. Let's say if something like bishop e6, a5. Then knight to e3 gives white chances for an advantage. This is, I think, white's best try to fight for a plus. But castling was played, and now knight to f6 was played. Knight to b3 and queen f6. So the point here is that black nicely supports the knight on f4. And it's going to be not so easy for white to chase away the knight without giving up the bishop pair. So probably the most natural idea is just to play bishop takes f4, queen takes f4, queen c1. And for the most part, maybe even just try to go straight into the ending. Play a5, queen g5, and just go into this. And for instance, if take h6, white can try to go for d4. Probably the position is approximately equal. And the reason is because the bishop on a7, the unopposed bishop, just simply isn't that powerful. Anyway, I'm going to try to skip to the most important moment. Rook e1 was played, g5, nice aggressive move, bishop takes f4. So now Komodo took, but now this wasn't quite the ideal moment because black could take with the g-pawn, opening up the g-file, and opening up the g2 point to long-term pressure. That being said, I do want to make a very important point here. Even though black has the bishop pair and an attacking line down the g-file, it's not easy at all to attack it. So unless white is actually forced to lose material, his position might not actually be that bad. So white played d4 now. Seems reasonable. Queen g7. White went king h1. Seems like a safe place for the king. King h2 is also possible. King h8, so black prepares rook g8. Queen d2. Bishop to d7. Black just continues development, preparing to connect the rooks and allowing black to play rook a d8. White plays rook to a2. I think what I would have done now with white is I think I would just play simply bishop to d5, and if rook a b8, then rook g1. And then in this position, this looks very solid. For instance, let's say knight e7, take. If we have a position like this, I don't think the bishop pair is going to be that overwhelming. For instance, let's say I play a5 and then knight c5. So if you look at white's minor pieces here, everything's defended, g2 is completely safe, bishop on d5, knight on c5 are doing pretty well. It's kind of hard to believe black could have some trouble here. White could have some trouble from black's attack here. But I think what happened is that look at white's rook play over the next couple moves. It looks very suspicious. Rook a2, then later going rook a4, then later you'll see the white rook just kind of shuffle around ineffectively. So rook a2, rook a d8 looks like a good move. b5, okay, that seems fair enough to chase the knight away. Doesn't look like a bad move. Take, knight e7, queen to e2, rook d e8. It also would have been reasonable to play rook g8 on any number of these moves. White would have probably played queen to f1. So now white played queen f1. Also a totally reasonable move. Knight g6. So here is one of the first moments where it starts to get a little funky for white. White went rook a4. Don't really like that move very much. Also don't really see exactly what he's trying to do. Is he trying to defend the d4 pawn? It's not totally clear. I would have preferred something simple, just like bishop to d5. This forces black to either defend b7 or push ahead with c6, but both of those I think will favor white. I mean, favor white compared to the game. So rook a4, rook g8, rook a2. Okay, just shuffling of the rooks. Rook ef8, knight bd2. So basically, we've kind of reached an impasse here where both sides can't really find a clear way to make progress. Black has the bishop pair. The unopposed bishop on b6 is quite a good piece, but it's not quite clear how to actually break through here. So queen h6 was played. Take, take. White opens up some lines here. Rook ea1. Bishop to c5. So both sides aren't really doing too much here. Let's see, bishop to e2. Then they shuffle again. Bishop c4, bishop c8, bishop e2, bishop e6, bishop c4. Okay. And now, finally, Stockfish does something different. Plays knight h4, trades off a pair of knights. Okay, this opens up the g file. Knight f3, queen to f6. So we have kind of a more pure example of the bishop pair here. So g2 is defended, f2 is defended. Everything seems to be relatively safe in white's position. So it's going to take some work if black's going to create some big threats here. So black has a couple potential pawn breaks. c6 is a pawn break. f5 is a pawn break. It's going to be important to try to execute some type of break or try to put enough pressure on g2 or f2 to be able to make some progress. So rook d1 was played. Looks like a generally useful move. Rook e8, bishop c4. Okay, putting the bishop on its best square. Queen g6, rook aa1. Yeah, some of the shuffling here looks a little bit silly when you see the rook on the a file just shuffling back and forth everywhere. But when everything's defended, can't really be argued against too harshly. So queen h6, bishop c4, queen g6. More shuffling of the rooks. Queen h5, bishop e2, queen g6, rook aa1. Okay, white plays b6 now. All right, this is a pawn sacrifice to double and isolate the b pawns. C takes b6, bishop c4. So another point is that it did give the bishop potentially the d5 square. So that's actually what white tried to occupy here. So bishop c4, bishop c7, rook d3, rook ef8, bishop d5. So it was basically a positional pawn sacrifice to put the bishop on d5 and try to basically argue that even though black has the bishop pair, he has double and isolated b pawns. The bishop on d5 is doing a good job. The rook on d3 is doing a nice job of just covering everything along the third rank. So for the time being, everything seems to be defended reasonably well. Queen h5, knight e1. Okay, so the knight on e1, what you'll notice is that it defends the g2 pawn. So g2 is well defended by the knight. h3 is well defended by the rook. So everything is under control here. Bishop d6, rook a8. Okay, white's ready to trade off some pieces if black decides to, try anything, like move his bishop at some point. Queen to h6. And now what was played here? Queen h6, king h2. Yeah, none of this seems bad. This all seems to be defensible. It was possible to try the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes c8 here. Rook takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop takes f7, and then bishop d5. But it wasn't entirely clear if this would be solid enough to defend. So I can understand why king h2 was played. So rook g7, rook f3. So notice how the rook is doing a good job of defending the third rank. Notice that for black to actually win this, he needs a focal point. He needs some place where he's actually going to break through. So bishop e7, more shuffling. Queen b5, queen f6, queen c4, bishop c5, king g1. Okay, quite a bit of shuffling here. King f1. Okay, it turns out the king's perfectly safe here. So the king running from h2 to f1 had no particular drawback. Takes a while to get to the critical point here. A lot of shuffling here. And basically black was looking for the right moment to try to break through somehow and have some type of decisive tactical blow, but it didn't come for quite a while. So queen h5, rook to b8, queen g6, rook a8, queen f6, rook f3. Notice how everything's covered. Everything's covered. h3's covered, g2's covered, f2's covered. So even in a position like this, with the bishop pair, with rooks doubled on the g-file, an extra pawn, it's by no means easy to win this. So rook to d3. Now black plays b5. Queen to c2. Queen g5, queen a2, queen f6, rook f3, rook d8. Okay, let's just skip ahead a couple more moves. Queen g5, queen a2, queen e7. So nothing was really achieved by black over the course of a bunch of moves. Queen to d2, bishop c5, queen c2, rook to d8, queen to b2, rook g to g8, rook to a1. Now rook to d6 was played. So as you can see in this game, what's so complicated about it is that there's so much shuffling over all these moves, but white is finally about to be in a position, where he might have to play some accurate defensive moves. So white has essentially just had a fortress for these last 25, 30 moves. So black hasn't actually found a way to break through here, and this is often what happens in games like these. You'll often have cases where you might even be down a pawn, you might even be down a pawn and the exchange. But if the opponent doesn't have a concrete way to actually beat you, then of course you have no reason to give up. So one expression that I always repeat is don't despair, look for compensation. And sometimes that the compensation you have is just the simple fact that the opponent isn't able to break through you. They're not able to actually physically win any more material or promote a pawn or attack your king. So that's one of the important things to notice here, that white's position is very, very solid, and as long as it doesn't collapse, the burden is totally on black to prove something. So we're just about to reach the critical moment where black's attack is finally going to reach a head, you could say. So let's go on to this next moment in a second. I just wanted to point out that it's important to realize in this kind of position here that we should never become complacent just because material is in our favor, or just because it looks like our opponent seemingly has to resign or is having a lot of defensive difficulties. So really, when it comes to attack and defense, you actually really have to have a clear focal point, a clear target, and a way to really break through. Because one thing you'll notice here is that everything has been defended, and black isn't queening any pawns. He does have the bishop pair, but he still has to do quite a bit of work to turn this into something. So there's quite a lot to do even from here. So all right, let's go back to where we were. Rook d8, queen b2, rook g8, rook a1, rook to d6. Okay, so what black does here is black basically shuffles everything to the g-file and is still looking for ways to create decisive threats. So it still actually wasn't easy to find a way to break through here. So what ends up happening is after rook to d6, rook a to d1 is played. All right, white has a very solid blockade here. Now black played rook d to g6. White played queen takes b5. Rook 8 to g7. Okay, so white was able to regain the pawn, and we're reaching a critical moment here. So after rook 1 to d2, I think, by the way, the best move was just to play rook f3, remaining solid, keeping this under control, keeping h3 under control. And really, it remains to be seen whether black would be able to win this position. Black has a lot of work to do in order to win this position. But let's pause right here. After this move, black is objectively winning. And this is the position that I showed to 5 different grandmasters, a bunch of different international masters, a bunch of different players of all levels. And the hint is that it's an interference tactic that may sort of give it away in a certain sense because there just aren't that many possibilities. But basically what happened here is that black found a way to weaken white's king position and create an attack kind of out of nowhere. So I'll pause for about 15 seconds and let's see if you can try to find an idea. Okay, so the incredible move that black played here was now bishop to e3. And I think this move deserves 2 exclamation marks and is really just a mind-blowing move. I mean, what's so incredible about this move here is that it's very hard to even understand the point of it. When you see the lines, you'll totally get it. So here's one variation. So let's say rook a2 is played. Let's say you just move the rook out of the way. Here's one of the key points. Black plays bishop takes, pawn takes, check, king to e2, and then takes. What you'll notice is that the white king completely runs out of squares. Take, check, king to e2, and here there's f3 check. And notice how the white king simply gets checkmated. It just gets checkmated here. We have check, take, and now the key check is this one, queen h5 check. King to e3. Notice how the king had no other squares. Every other square was controlled here. So the king has to go to e3, and now there's rook e1 check. And there's simply queen e2 mate or queen d1 mate. So what ends up happening here is when you play this interference move, what you're doing is you're blocking this white rook from defending h3 if they move the rook out of the way. So that's the explanation of the tactic here. So this move Stockfish played against Komodo was really incredible, an extremely deep idea. So what happens if they take the piece? That's the first thing we have to ask ourselves. If they just take the piece, what happens? So f takes e3, and now what I think was so incredible about this is that it seems to come out of nowhere. So we've sacrificed a piece, we've sacrificed our unopposed bishop, and now there's f3. And what ends up happening after this f3 move is we've sacrificed a piece, and now we're sacrificing a further pawn. And this is why I think it's so difficult. So you sacrifice a piece, then you sacrifice a pawn, and then after you've sacrificed a piece and a pawn, you play a quiet move. And this quiet move, queen to f6, is threatening mate. Threatening take, check, and then mate with the 2 rooks on the first and second rank because the king has no squares. So it's a threat of an immediate mate. So this f3 move is really spectacular. And there's some very nice points here. Some very nice tactical points. For instance, if here we can play take, king to g1, and here we can play this. And so if they try to come back and defend, I can play queen g5. And let's say they play something like knight takes, I can play queen takes. And now I'm pinning the rook and I'm threatening to go rook takes g2 check. So this is completely winning as well. So allow me to go back. Just go back to this key moment. So now what we get to see here is what happened in the game. Queen f6. So the defense basically collapsed here. If you try to defend with rook f2, there's rook takes g2. And rook takes g2 is decisive. So really just an incredible combination. One of the deepest I've seen before. What's so amazing is that you expect it to have to be immediate. But what you can see in this line, I mean in the line where you take it, is so in the other line where you move the rook out of the way, there's bishop takes h3. In this line, there's f3. So again, you're seeing that the rook is blocked from preventing f3. So this bishop e3 double exclamation mark interference move, it interfered with 2 of the rook's defenses. The defense of f3 and the defense of h3. So bishop e3 was an unbelievable interference tactic. So one you definitely don't have to feel guilty about not finding, but one which is really amazing. And I think anyone is capable of understanding it. That's exactly why I'm showing this. But it's just something to ponder over because it has so many different ideas. It has two different breakthrough ideas, the idea of breaking through with f3 or with bishop takes h3, a bunch of different mating ideas. It also, the bishop on e3 covers the d2 square, so we have mating net ideas too. We just have such a broad range of different ideas that it's just really, really an incredible move. So I'll just show the end of the game. f3, knight takes f3, queen f6, and here white pretty much just gave it away. White went king to e2, just gave the piece back. Rook takes g2, king to d1, queen takes f3 check, and this ended very quickly. So now basically what black did was just set up an attack. It went rook to g1, c4, rook to a1, queen to b2, basically just surrounded the king. Rook g to g1, rook a3, and black of course doesn't trade rooks, so rook a e1, and now the queen's coming in. Queen to f1, and it all ends very quickly. Another nice move I really liked here was this move, rook to b1. Just threatening to mate here, threatening queen c1 mate. So just a nice little move here with rook b1, cutting off the king once again, not checking the king away to safety. So the king tries to run away. Black brings the queen in here. Queen c1 check. King to d4. Another great move here. Rook to b3, and of course the rook can't be captured because of queen takes d2 check. So what happens here is after bishop takes f7, queen a1 check was played, and now white finally resigned, and a sample line here is the queen gets lost due to the pin on g5. Take, rook to g5, and black wins. So just an amazing combination here. I just want to highlight this again. Bishop to e3, an incredible move, covering the d2 square, putting the king in danger, and having threats in some cases of bishop takes h3, and if it's captured, of playing f3, and we've interfered with the rook's defenses. So an unbelievable move intending to simply win the exchange and win the game. So really one of the most amazing tactics I've ever seen before, and beautiful to see it played out. But another point I want to make here is that even though this is such a deep and incredible tactic, this type of thing can be perfectly well understood. All we really had to do here is think, well, why did this work exactly? Let's look at all the key lines. Let's see what happens if you take the piece. What happens if we just play out these lines and see how natural play develops? And that's exactly what we did here. We looked at all the critical tries. What happens if you move the rook away? And what happens if you take the piece? What happens after you take the piece if you push the pawn up and take the pawn? Or what happens if you try to run away with the king? And in all cases, the breakthrough works, and white's king cannot be defended. So the game ended rather abruptly, and the white king just got caught in the middle of the board. And finally, white had to resign. So this is the most amazing interference tactic I've ever seen before. If you've seen a better one, please post it below.